an Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Spoil Me, covering the final 50 pages of Fire and Hemlock by Diana Wynn-Jones, brought to you by Patricia Bing Grant. In this episode, we discuss the reveal of what's really been happening and the sort of obscure, opaque ending that I'm still not entirely sure about. Welcome to Spoil Me. Welcome to the show, everybody. I am Natasha, and this episode, oh man, guys, there is so much that happens here. First of all, I want to start off by apologizing to Patricia. Patricia has been running into more problems with me during this scheduling process than anybody, and I felt so bad because this has been maybe my favorite book that's been commissioned so far, and I was like, could I run into these problems on a book that I'm not super excited about? But she had intended to commission a live read of the first 9 pages, I believe, of the next chapter after the one that I had just wrapped on last episode. And she had to leave the crowdcast before it had ended. And, she had sent me an email a couple days earlier, and normally I check my email really regularly, but I'd been super busy and had not been on top of it. So I missed the email, and she missed my comment that I was so excited about finding out what was happening that I was going to finish the crowdcast and immediately pick up the book and continue reading. So I got a chapter and a half in. I stopped because I got a notification on my phone that pulled me into my email, and then I saw it, and I had just finished reading. I mean, it was just really mean the way that the timing worked out, and I felt so bad. So I'm sorry, Patricia, for ruining your plans, but on the other hand, I saved you $10. But yeah, you guys, this next section is crazy town, and I can understand why you had been wanting to do that. So I am going to read some parts of it, because basically it's all of the memory that has come back to Polly about how she tried to get the truth out of Mr. Lynn. And it's sort of a weird, it straddles that line for me between I'm going to get over it and be fine with it, and also this was a little bit too easy. And again, I think I've mentioned this in other podcasts, but I really have gotten more sensitive to this kind of thing since finishing Dark Tower, because Dark Tower is riddled with, he didn't know how he knew to do such and such. He just knew. She wasn't sure how she knew that this would work, but she knew it would. They didn't know how, but they all knew that they were right. It gets very, very, I'm in a corner, don't know what to do, and I'm just going to write it like my characters are somehow psychic. So I am trying to be charitable here, even though having just finished Dark Tower shortly, about a month ago at this point, even less, I have a knee-jerk reaction to that kind of thing. But this is, Polly realizes that she needs to do something really kind of magical in order to question Tom, and apparently just knows how, knows what the ingredients are going to be. So she goes and finds some hemlock and hawthorn and goes and uses a silver ashtray to burn it all in with the Fire and Hemlock picture propped against the wall with the ashtray in front of that and the twigs in between. And she uses the painted soldiers that Tom gave her plus a postcard from him. And I think she uses some of her own hair or blood. Yeah, her own hair. That's right. So, when everything was ready, Polly unhooked the stolen oval photograph and knelt down in front of the table, facing the picture in the greatest of excitement. She remembered seeing her own face, vivid, almost laughing, reflected in the glass of the fire and Hemlock picture, while she struck a match and lit one corner of the postcard. When that was burning, she carefully poked it among the straw and hair in the ashtray. She knelt, holding the stolen photograph, while chaffy smoke began to wreath upwards. The photograph, she was sure, had power to bring Tom to her. Both pictures together would surely make him tell. She told herself that she did not really think it would work, but she knew it would. So all of this smoke pours through the room, and it's like more smoke than really could possibly be actually just coming from what she's burning. And then finally, when she can see through it again, she is seeing into another room that she is not familiar with. And Tom is on a sofa in there, and he comes running towards her because he can see her and says, "Polly, what are you doing?" And she says, "I've come to ask you some questions at last," thinking that the woman that he's with, that she can sort of see off to the side, is Mary. She is wrong. It is Laurel. Laurel is not happy about this. Tom is trying to get her to go away. Polly is trying to get him to talk to her. And finally, and he tells her, because she's in the middle of like yelling at him, "Well, how can I help you if you didn't tell me? I sent you enough books about it," Tom said angrily. That's not the same, Polly was saying when Tom moved sharply aside. Behind him, Laurel was awake, sitting up on the sofa. "Tom?" she said, like a little icy needle. "The undying Laurel is awake," Tom said to Polly. She noticed he had put one hand up to his face, almost as if he was trying to shield his eyes. Polly did not understand. Laurel said, "Tom," again, warningly. Polly looked at her and met Laurel's eyes. After that, Polly was only aware of Laurel and the empty tunnels of Laurel's eyes. Everything went a little muzzy then. Polly knew she had cleared up the charred stuff in the ashtray and hung both pictures up again. Probably she tidied everything away. She must have taken the ashtray back to the living room because it was certainly there afterwards. She knew she was downstairs with the kettle on to make Granny some tea when the doorbell rang, unless that was a day later. If this was the same day, Laurel had worked awfully fast. So Seb is at the door and tells her to come by the house because everybody's there, even Tom's here. And she follows him along, and then we have this moment with Laurel. And this is a really great tie-in with what Tom had said earlier about being a hero and knowing now that it's not just about being like brave in scary situations, but being brave in embarrassing situations and standing your ground. And that is something that, I last time talked about in context of like a Veronica Mars episode where she has to let people believe that she's an idiot in order to get information, and how my ego does not tolerate that kind of thing. But I'm also thinking about like these days, people are afraid to make a fuss, even though right and wrong have become even clearer, if anything, than they used to be. And it's this fear of making a fuss, drawing attention to ourselves, embarrassing other people, creating rifts with someone that we know life would be easier if we got along with them. This is the kind of thing that is leading to the situations that we're in. So we all need to just get it together and stop being a bunch of whining cowards and just, holy shit, guys, let's just do the right thing and not think about that. Can we do that? We need to try and do that. Anyway, so Laurel comes and sits with her and says, "Polly, dear, I've been wanting to have a little talk with you for quite a while now. Seb tells me you may have some very strange ideas in your head about poor Tom. I suspect you may have mistaken the situation quite appallingly. We're all very fond of Tom, and so sad about him." Poor Tom. He's going to die in about 4 years now. The doctors can't do a thing. Terrible, isn't it? One of those cancer things. That's why I said I'd speak to you when Tom asked me to. He asked you to? Polly said. Of course. Laurel put a knuckle to her other eye. Or I'd never have dreamed of saying a word. I still adore Tom. We only got divorced because he insisted on it when he heard the news. Oh, my heaven, Polly thought. What an idiot I've been. Of course Laurel and Mr. Leroy would want to keep an eye on Tom if they knew he was ill. It was quite possible that she had gone blundering in, mistaking the whole thing entirely. She had thought there was something supernatural. How stupid and babyish. There was no such thing. He's the soul of consideration, poor Tom, Laurel said. And loving him as I do, I quite understand how you feel, Polly. Let me see, you first met Tom at Seb's mother's funeral, didn't you? And then, of course, you were quite a little girl. Children always adore poor Tom. But I do think nowadays you might show him the kind of consideration he always shows you. You're embarrassing him, dear. You've got what's called a crush on him, haven't you? Polly could not say anything. Shame rose up in her and scoured through her, bleaching everything. This was far worse than she had ever felt in Bristol. She could only look across at Tom's hunched shape, bleached faint and wavering like a mirage. Oh, what a fool she had been. I'm asking you to leave poor Tom in peace for the little time he has left, Laurel said kindly, gently. I know it's hard, but couldn't you agree to forget him? Polly tried to say. Everyone in the room must have known what a fool she had been. She could see faces turning to her, dimly, smiling kindly and pityingly. He's only got 4 years, and you've got the rest of your life, Laurel said gently. Think what it means to him when he had to ask me to ask you. Polly could take no more. She put her teacup down on the small table near her chair and then backed away from it with her hand stretched out to push it from her, as if the teacup were her stupidity. And that was a silly way to behave, too. The people who had been looking at her were all turning away, embarrassed to look. Think, said Laurel, if someone was hanging round you, pestering and sighing for all the life you had— Oh, all right, don't go on, Polly cried out. I didn't mean— Of course I'll forget him. Just leave me alone. Things began to go dim after that. Polly remembered sitting for a while bolt upright and staring at nothing, wishing she could leave, or that she could crawl into a hole and die of shame. She remembered her relief when Seb came and said it was time to go now. Polly got up and went with him into the hall with the jointed staircase and the Ali Baba jars where things were already fading, bleached away by her shame, she thought then, when she heard Seb say, Hey, now look here, Tom, you're not supposed— Oh, well. Polly looked round to find that Tom had come out into the hall, too. Goodbye, Polly, he said, and bent down to give her a kiss on her forehead. Since Polly turned and looked up as he did it, the kiss landed briefly and awkwardly on her mouth. Brief, awkward, and sideways, Polly remembered, which caused Tom to take a hold of her shoulder to pull her into a better position. But Seb gave a meaning cough, and he let go. And that was really all she remembered. As soon as she left the house, her memory started to run single. And plain and dull, she thought. And she had done it to herself, and deserved it all, even being engaged to Seb for not having the sense to remember something Tom had said himself, that being a hero means ignoring how silly you feel. She had let Laurel embarrass her into a state in which she could not even think straight. Laurel's persuasions, she could see blazingly clearly now, had all been aimed at making her say she would forget Tom. Without that, they could not have done a thing to her, and not, it seemed to follow, to Tom either. But they would have kept on at me, Polly thought. They would have got me to say it in the end. That was bound to follow, once she had opened the way by doing her peculiar piece of prying on Tom. So, and, you know, she's also thinking about the fact that she did that magic and that was like a totally wrong thing to do. But, you know, she was angry and trying to like kind of find a shortcut to the solution, which I think we can all relate to. And it's a really tough thing to read, like, because Laurel knows human nature so well that she understands how easy it would be to humiliate somebody in general, but also especially Polly, because she has abandonment issues. She is sure that people don't want her around, and she just really zeroed in on that and made it seem like Tom doesn't even want to tell you this himself because he's so embarrassed by you that he would send someone else to do his dirty work, which, like, ouch, you know? So this whole while she's remembering all of this, she's in the apartment with Fiona. And Fiona, I love her because, like, she doesn't really know what's going on, of course, but she's just so supportive of Polly either way. Like, it just shows a real faith in her friend. Despite not necessarily understanding everything, there's a real, like, solidity about her. And that's something that I don't feel like Polly has really had in her life, except for her grandma. And it's really nice that she has found someone that she can have that with it, while she's away at college as well. So then she starts looking through all of the books, especially since Gran had suggested that maybe that would help her. And she starts looking through, she thinks that the Golden Bough is going to be the one, but the first book of fairy stories that Tom had sent her is the one that falls off the shelf and opens to the page of the story East of the Sun and West of the Moon, where the girl gets too curious and the man vanishes to nowhere to marry someone else, and she has an awful job to get him back. Okay. I looked into this a little bit. It turns out that a huge amount of this story is based on a classic, I think, Irish folktale, which honestly, I was so into Celtic and Irish and English folktales as a kid that I'm blown away that I didn't know this. But it's done so closely that if you did know, half of this couldn't be a surprise, I would imagine. But I just, like, it's the name of the character in the original story, was Tan something. I don't know if it's Tan Cool specifically, but she like uses the name almost exactly out of the original story. So if you did know this, it would just be so much, like, you would be able to put this together so much better than I had, but I really had no idea. Tam Lynn, thank you. Patricia's in the comments saying it's in the Oxford Book of Ballads, which is free online. Ooh, I'm going to look into that. Yes, please. So she asks Fiona what date it is because she's putting together the thing that I did about Halloween, and says, "Oh my God, I am going to be too late. I have to go to Granny's at once." So she decides to call Seb, and I adore this because the way that she's behaving when she picks up the phone to call Seb, Fiona tells her later, "I was really hoping that you were about to dump him." And Polly's like, "Oh, no, trust me. I'm gonna dump him. It's about to happen, but I just needed to, like, get some help from him first." So she calls Seb basically to ensure that she's right about exactly what's going on, that they're all going to be at the house on Halloween and the whole thing goes on. And this whole thing, it's so hard to, like, read because I just hate Seb so much, and the way that he's, like, just screwing her, and not literally yet, I don't think, but he's like, it's the equivalent of magical drugging. You know, I hate him so much. So she takes the bus the next day. And she's reading the ballads, and she thought about them the whole way. They were both about young men Laurel had owned, but their fates had been rather different. Thomas the Rhymer was a harpist and a man of considerable spirit, When Laurel proposed rewarding him for his services by giving him the gift of always speaking the truth, Thomas objected very strongly indeed. He said his tongue was his own, but Laurel went ahead and gave it him. And what an awkward gift, Polly thought, one which could be downright embarrassing if Laurel happened to be annoyed when she gave it him. True Thomas, she called him, and turned him back into his ordinary world with his awkward gift after 7 years. In the book, the story stopped there, but Polly knew she had read a longer version, perhaps in another book Tom had sent her, which made it clear that Thomas the Rhymer was still Laurel's property even after he got home. Years later, she came and fetched him away, and he did not come back. The second Thomas had been taken as a boy, and he had escaped. He was rescued by a splendid girl called Janet, who was forever hitching her skirt up and racing off to battle against the odds. When the time came, Janet had simply hung on to her tam. Laurel, or whatever she was calling herself then, had been furious. Polly could only hope she might manage to do what Janet had done, but she was very much afraid it would not quite be like that. Yeah, this whole thing is just like crashing down on her. I mean, the amount of information and the weird twistiness of it and just the surrealness is all hitting her. And, keep in mind, I'm reading this the first time and I'm coming at this now, reading it to you guys with more understanding because I finished the book by now. But when I'm reading this for the first time, I am still so confused about what Laurel actually is. And it's never specifically said in the book that she's like a fairy queen, I don't think. I think that Polly calls him, her and Mr. Leroy king and queen. I don't know if she uses the word fairy or maybe she does at the very, very end. But this was like my only theory that I had, if you guys remember, when I was like talking about what could possibly be going on because of the musicians, and that's been, sort of a trope that fairies are totally into people who are great with music. So that being what is indeed happening was really surprising because I didn't understand how Mr. Leroy factored into this whole thing, because Mr. Leroy is, 1, not charming, 2, very ugly, and 3, he's not the consort of Laurel in any way that seems to make sense. That we've seen, there's no closeness there. But then later on, we start to find out exactly how this works. And there's a reason why it didn't make sense to my weird human brain, because the timing of everything is so bizarre and cyclical that it wouldn't make sense. Because you're thinking that people live and die and move on, and that's not how things work for them. So Granny opens the door and immediately knows that Polly has figured out what's happening. Polly read both ballads aloud to her slowly and emphatically, pausing to explain the difficult words. "Well," she said when she had finished. "Read them again," said Granny. Polly did so. "Does that mean anything to you, Granny?" Granny nodded. "It's laid on them not to say, nor me to remember, but I keep what I can in my head by living where I do," which I want more about that. Is the land she lives on, or I don't know. I'm wondering what Granny means by that. She likes them young, she likes them handsome, and musical, if she can get them. She seems to have a fancy for the name Tom, too, doesn't she? But those rhymes have got one thing wrong, Polly. It's every 9 years that the funeral comes down. "And last time was a woman," said Polly. "Seb's mother, supposedly Laurel's mother, who is of course the same person as Laurel. Laurel takes a new life every 81 years, and I suppose she has to pretend the dead woman is her mother so that she can inherit from herself. I think Thomas Lynn was lucky he didn't have to go then. Do you remember him now, Granny?" "Oh, yes," said Granny. "The young man with the pictures. I should have been kinder to him for bringing you away from that house, but I was scared. I was going by Mint Chalk, you see. She ran away from him on sight, and I thought, he's one of hers, that one. He'll be lucky if he can call his soul his own, and I was right, wasn't I?" "You may have been then," Polly said, "but he was getting free somehow. I know he was, until I stopped him." "I know it," Granny said. "Mint Chalk sat on his knee the second time he came. That was a rainy day, and he was just off to Australia. I'd terrible sciatica that day." And she's like, Polly's like, wait, really? What are you talking about? And Granny tells Polly, finally, that she told Tom to leave Polly the fuck alone. Which, again, here, I didn't understand yet what she meant. Because I didn't understand what Tom was doing by befriending Polly in the first place. But she tells Polly, told him off. You can look at me how you like, Polly, but I did right and you know it. You were barely 14 and you worshipped the ground he walked on, and it was not right of him to let you. You'd your own life to live, Polly. It wouldn't have been right even if he was what he seemed and not one of hers. And so I told him. He took it well, too. I don't think he'd quite seen it before. And then when she says he looked stricken and said he wouldn't forgive himself for using you, Polly, like, is starting to get a handle on it. But I still, as the reader, had no idea. So I'm going to talk about that for a second. Patricia, please feel free to jump in here with, like, some clarifications, because obviously, having only read this roughly twice, there were, like, I didn't go back and read it from beginning to end twice. I read it once and then went back and, like, reread sections. Tom knew that Polly wasn't part of this whole thing, and latched onto her as and hoped to make her grow attached to him so that she could save him, right? Like, he cultivated an affection between the two of them to make it so that she wanted to save him. Which is, like, a really fucked up thing to do, because she was, 10 when they met? And this is something, like, for the remainder of this book that makes me incredibly uncomfortable. That the two of them, it seems, are going to go on to have a romantic relationship when I am just so uncomfortable with that happening with a dude who was, like, an adult when she was a child. And I don't know if he doesn't age for the 9 years between the funerals, if, like, by the time she's 19, she's kind of caught up with him a little bit more. I'm not sure that that's ever really, like, specified, but it just makes me really, like, creeped out. You know, if we had just left that whole aspect out of this, I think I would have really liked this ending and felt better about it. But as far as it was, I was just sort of surprised at Diana Wynn-Jones for, like, choosing that after the weirdness of Polly's relationships with many men in this book. I didn't really... I felt like she was sort of undermining the point that she had been making with some of those other instances earlier. Patricia saying, I think he called on help and she showed up and he was surprised. That's the weird part of the book, which as a kid I didn't mind, but as an adult it's creepy as fuck. Yeah, you know, I could see as a kid just being like, oh, okay, and they wind up together. Because as a kid, stories that you read and see are so conventional that the man and the girl winding up together is just sort of something that you take for granted as, like, being part of the ending. And it's more surprising if that's not what happens than anything. But yeah, as a grown-up, when you really understand the difference between their ages and that he was driving around a literal child and actively trying to kind of get her to fall for him, knowing that it was just to save his own ass, and then it actually turns into a genuine affection, I guess. It's just a really uncomfortable situation that I just have a lot of misgivings about. I don't know if he was trying to get her to fall for him, but he definitely wanted her to save him somehow. Yeah, that's fair. I don't know if it's getting to fall for, but at least become so attached to him. If not in love, but at least love, you know? But so, yeah. Polly says, I've often wondered why they never tried to take it back, the fire in Hemlock. My guess is they couldn't, Granny said. It must have been his to give, and he gave it you. It looks to me as if the back unclips. Take it up, but carefully. So inside is a hank of hair between the board and the back of the photograph, which is the obicept. So I had theorized that she was the obicept, and I was rather close. The obicept is the hair that I guess is part of the spell. And the wavy end she touched dissolved to dust as her finger met it. I'm wondering, like, because Granny seems to think that you may have voided the charm, but there's no need to kill him, which I'm like, really? The hair? Like, with that, like, touching it, making some of it dissolve, did Tom, like, stumble and clutch at his heart and go, oh God, like, did he feel that? I'm very curious about how this works, and the fact that she says it must have been his to give. I don't understand how he was given control over the item that contained the charm in the first place. Like, one would think that if this fire in Hemlock was the controlling photo, that this would have been kept in Laurel's room and not put amongst the things that were meant to, be shared. Like, even if it was, oh, this is on one side of the room and that's the side that you can't take anything from, that's still, like, very much out in the open. And it's poor security is what I'm saying. So the night it is good Halloween, the fairy folk do ride, and they that would their true love win at miles cross they must bide. That's where you do, plain as a pikestaff. What, go to the station? Where else, said Granny. Between 12 and 1 o'clock, it says. But I should be there by 11 if I were you. We don't know what clock they're keeping. And the instructions are very clear and detailed, as Polly thinks. There'll be 3 companies, and he'll be in the last. And not the brown or the black, but the white. Are you sure? Well, you'll have to look sharp about you. It may not seem the same in these modern days. And then just hang on to him, I suppose, whatever they do to stop me, Polly said. That's what Janet did, but I've a feeling that won't seem the same either. If she could, you can, Granny said. She chuckled. I must say that I like Janet, even though she was no better than she should be. She was quiet for a moment, sitting very upright, with the clock ticking loudly in the near dark of the kitchen. Polly could see the white outlines of Granny's face, and no more. It struck her suddenly that she now knew what Granny looked like when she was young, knew it properly, not just from a photograph. And I envy her, too, Granny added. What do you mean? Polly asked. Your grandfather, said Granny. He was called Tom, too. She does like that name. You should have heard him play the violin, Polly. But she took him when the 9 years were up. I didn't know any charm to help. I was left alone, with Reg ready to be born. Oh. There seemed nothing that Polly could say. This explained so much about Granny, and probably a great deal about Reg, too. She sat in the dark, thinking of Granny with all these years, doing what she could not to forget, and a memory came to her. And she thinks about one of the photos that was up in Laurel's room, and that it probably was her grandfather. Which is just such a weird, like, that I love this reveal that her grandmother knows what they are, not just because she's like a savvy, superstitious woman, but because they affected her life this way. That she went through something so similar to what Polly's going through and knew what was happening and eventually, like, took measures to protect Polly, even though she tried to sit back and, she was trying to do with Polly and Tom what she was doing with Polly and her parents, which was hope that the other adult would do the fucking responsible right thing. And nobody did. So she keeps having to step in and be like, hey, idiot, stop it. I know what you're doing. Which is really, like, must be very tiring to always be in that position. I think it was a test. Fairies like tests. Patricia, are you talking about the pictures on either side of the room was a test? Huh. But isn't that such a huge risk? Like, fairies like tests, I would think, when there's not a risk to them, when it's just a risk to the, like, I don't know, maybe. So, At this point, Polly starts to get ready to head out to the train station. That's my answer to all things fairies. Yeah, they are a little inscrutable. So she goes to the train station, and while she's there the whole time, she's like, oh, this was a mistake. This is not where I'm supposed to be. Why did I come here? I shouldn't have come here. I should have gone to the other, like, oh, why did I do this? This is really stupid. And she's just standing there thinking that over and over again. And finally, there were some people coming. Polly heard them crossing the court in the distance and in a regular splashing of feet. A lot of them with whistles, catcalls, and loud, drunken-sounding laughter. They went straight to the station building, laughing and whooping and pushing one another about, where in the doorway their progress was interrupted by the inevitable drunken quarrel. The group milled about, and loud young voices barked like dogs for a second or so. After that, they seemed to sort it out, and all went piling into the booking hall. But just for that second, enough dim light fell on the struggling bodies for Polly to see that one of them was Leslie. I think this really is it, she thought. Shortly after that, several big cars drove into the forecourt. Each raced past Polly, slashing rain across her, gleaming under the light so that they looked almost unreal, and stopped in a group near the station entrance. The doors opened, the headlights blazed ample, freckled light. And so here's Laurel and Mr. Leroy and Seb and a crowd of other people equally well dressed. And then behind that, more cars. And at this point comes the quartet. Ed in black, Sam in brown. Neither of them saw Polly. Tom came next, wearing a light-colored padded parka, carrying his cello case, and turning his light-colored head to say something to Anne, who was a little behind. So she follows them onto the train, and he pretends to not know who she is. And this is a moment where I'm still entirely unsure if he really didn't recognize her at this moment and she managed to break that spell in continuing to talk to him, or if he is at this moment just pretending not to know her. It feels like she thinks he's pretending and that it's insinuated later that they were just pretending. But I have a really hard time thinking that the rest of the quartet would agree to pretend that. Even if they thought it was like for her sake. I don't know. I just think that there was still a spell on them all. And she decides not to be embarrassed because he keeps trying to shake her off and be like, you need to let go of me. You need to leave me alone. And she's just like, yeah, you know what? I'm not leaving. And I don't really care if you're embarrassed. And I'm going to sit right across from you. So Ed, do you know me? Ed shook his head and tried to avoid her eyes. It was the way anyone behaves when a stranger tries to pester him on a train. Do you know me, Anne? Anne was clearly very tired. She looked up at Polly, direct and penetrating and dark, and frowned. I think I do, somehow, but I'm afraid I don't know your name. So that makes me think it's got to be this spell, right? She wouldn't, admit anything, I would think, if they had agreed to this. So she says to him, to Tom, I know I must be one more damn thing to you, but I have come to help if I can. I want to make amends for what I did to you, or apologize at least. Do you know the Oba sip turned out to be the fire in Hemlock picture? I had it all along. There was a lock of your hair in the back of it. I found it today. What institution did you escape from? And finally, she's just rambling about the umbrella from Granny and Granny telling him off. And finally, she hits on something. After all, Granny wasn't to know you'd already made it quite plain at the panto that I was nothing but a complete nuisance to come off that. Tom began violently and stopped. Did you happen to remark what your name was? He asked carefully. The laughter tore loose from Polly again. No, she said, I didn't, and you know it. And of course, my name isn't Polly, as you also know. It's Hero. So everybody else is under a spell. but he actually remembers her, is how I'm going to assess this entire thing. So they ride out to and like, this kind of killed me, that she doesn't have Polly ask the questions that I want her to ask about what exactly is going to happen. Like, all she's asking is about the past, and that is not what I want to know right now. Eventually, I do want to know that stuff too. But at this time, they're heading towards some huge event that's obviously supposed to end in Tom's death. And one would think you would want to accumulate as much information about that potential situation as you possibly can. That's, assuming that Tom knows anything about it. Even if he doesn't, you still ask, because you don't know that he doesn't. But this is where she says that the gift she gave you, things that you make up come true and then turn around and hit you. Not till you wrote Leroy by mistake for Legris, then I saw. But you still think this can't happen to me. I still do. Is it always like this? When they get off, when they are pulling in on the train, there's a beach. The sun is really bright. It's just like much different, I think, than she was expecting it to be. And finally, she gets off the train, and this place is so strange. It's really hot, even though it looks like autumn. And the leaves a lot of times are changing, orange, brown, red. But yeah, the heat is so intense that like a lot of people are sweating quite a lot. And when there's so much happening here, I'm trying to like make sure that I do justice to every fragment of the story. I knew you didn't understand. You were hanging on for about 5 years, but you stopped. I can't say I blame you. Anyhow, I'm quite glad of a chance to apologize. Apologize, said Polly. I'd have thought it was the other way around. Both ways round, then, said Tom. Mary Fields? Asked Polly. He shrugged. That, too, I suppose. Some of it was an attempt to keep the heat off you. Poor Mary. I haven't seen her for over a year now. So he was using Mary also, like wasn't really actually interested, but just kind of, there's so many questions about this. Like, why was she called the dragon? Why is that what Polly decided to assign to her? Just because she was unpleasant? So she says, why are you still trying to choke me off? You have been ever since I knew you. What else could I do? Tom demanded. I had to keep getting in touch and sending you things because you were my only chance, but I didn't have to like what I was doing, particularly after Morton found out, and I drove a bargain with Laurel after that not to harm you. Don't tell me, Polly said, and I've just made you break that one too. I told you not to protect me years ago. But you also told me not to be obedient, Tom pointed out. So this is when they get to Hunsden House, but it's the one in nowhere. We seem to have got nowhere, she said dryly. And this is the part. They wrapped their arms around one another. Tom was more solid and limber than Polly had expected, and warmer, and just a little gawky. He threaded both hands into Polly's damp hair and kissed her eyes as well as her mouth. I've always loved your hair, he said. I know, Polly said. Don't say you've always loved the hair of a child, like somebody that you've known since they were 10 years old, because that's really insinuating that you were like attracted to them when they were 10 years old. And that's not something that anybody wants to feel is true. That's very, very, very uncomfortable, and I don't like it. So, okay. Polly was lightheaded with strange, miserable joy. In a way, it was worth it, she thought, except that it was such a total waste. So, Leslie is there with Laurel. Leslie was lolling beside her on the seat. He did not seem to be able to take his eyes off Laurel. The look on his face was dreamy, besotted, adoring, but spiced with wickedness, as if at least half his feelings were guilty ones, which I really do enjoy. So, Ed and Sam and Anne are all here, and they all do know who she is at this point, and they all are playing music, which I thought, was apparently I thought that was going to be an attempt to rescue him in some way, but it turns out that Anne apparently is part of the Leroy clan, way back in her family, and as one of them, you're allowed to bring 3 guests to this event, and so by coming, she gives Polly a pass for being there. That they could have ejected Polly as not having the right, but because Anne claims her as a guest, they can't do that. So Anne is trying to head this whole thing off in her own way, even though she doesn't really know what to do either. Which I just love Anne so dearly. She's great. So then Seb sees her. And he comes up to her and says, "Polly, what are you doing? Think of me." "I am, and I don't like what I'm thinking. I don't like what you did." Seb, to do him justice, made no attempt to bluster or pretend. "But it was between me and him," he said. "It always was, and Tom used you too. Surely you understand, Polly. If they don't take him, they'll take me instead." Polly turned her eyes from his desperate, glaring face. So, Seb is really Mr. Leroy's son, or is Seb somebody totally else? Because she says here that she sees the resemblance. I don't understand why Seb is the one that's up for grabs if Tom doesn't go. I don't understand, what makes him, if he's actually related to Mr. Leroy, wouldn't that actually make him, off limits? If he's fairy blood? I had gotten the impression that using a human was required for this. And I guess there's nothing saying that specifically. But Patricia says if Mr. Leroy dies instead of Tom, he would be the next Mr. Leroy, I think. Oh. So Seb isn't worried that they're going to toss him in the pool. Seb is worried that his dad is going to die and then he's going to be dependent on 9-year increments of men to stay alive. I mean, I don't really have that much sympathy. Frankly, Seb, dude, you are already going to have it better than most people, so... Oh, and he'll be Laurel's. Okay, I got you. Which is why Polly doesn't have sympathy either. Yeah, all right. And when she's looking at Leslie, Seb tells her Laurel's not through with him. She won't let him go yet. Besides, he's not much of a life. Wow. Ouch. Okay. One of us has got to go, Seb insisted. My father's on his last legs. I think you're wrong, Patricia. One of us has got to go? I think that is what he's saying. I think that they would toss him. My father's on his last legs. He's been waiting 18 years now. And Tom's 10 years older than I am. He's had some time at least. So he's yeah, I think that he's talking about dying himself. Comparing the fact that he's gonna, not gonna have a chance to live his life. I never felt that because Polly said he won't die. Not literally. Does she? I don't see that part. If they don't take him, they'll take me instead. Laurel's not through with him. One of us has got to go. Oh God, Polly thought, what am I to do? Then they start playing music. I don't see that she says that to him. If you can find that, let me know. but not in that conversation anyway. Maybe I went through to after the song, and it was, isn't it odd how they always do something like this? It seems to bring out the best in them. Laurel was sitting up straight, smiling at Tom. You mustn't think I don't understand, but it's time now, Tom. And yeah, I don't see that. Not in the, it might be way later on. It isn't here though. So here comes the part that I feel is like the important part in terms of understanding what exactly happens here. And I'm going to say this straight out. I do not understand what happens here. I'm just going to say it. I have read it. I've reread it. I even found an interesting online essay trying to explain what happens. And I am confident that person understands it, but I do not think that they explained it well because I still didn't really get it. And I'm usually pretty good at grasping sort of esoteric ideas, and this didn't actually click for me. So I will read you guys part of that little essay later and kind of try and see if it works for y'all. So she's listening to the music, and it says she let the music take her with relief because while it lasted, she would not have to make a decision or come to a dead end. She found her mind dwelling on nowhere as she and Tom used to imagine it. You slipped between here and now to the hidden now and here, as Laurel had once told another Tom. There was that bonny path in the middle, but you did not necessarily leave the world. Here was a place where the quartet was grinding out dissonances. There was a lovely tune beginning to emerge from it. Two sides to nowhere, Polly thought. One really was a dead end. The other was the void that lay before you when you were making up something new out of ideas no one else had quite before. That's a discovery I must do something about, Polly thought, as the lovely tune sang out fully once and then fell away to end as the piece had begun in a long, sullen cello note. So that I think is where things start to solidify in my mind as to what her method was here. So then comes Mr. Piper busting in, and it turns out Mr. Piper is brothers with Tom, and Mr. Piper was supposed to be the one that Laurel took, I guess, and he made a deal that she would take Tom instead. Which I don't understand. I guess Mr. Piper they each had spells put on them to not remember each other. But that is super confusing to me, how Mr. Piper could have appeared in the Stow on the Water with his whole, what do you call it, hardware store, just when Tom had made that up, and still be real and still be Tom's brother. I am just so confused by how this whole thing works. Is it just oh, you invented this thing and I need to create a hardware store, so I'll just do the one with your brother? Is that a conscious decision that Laurel made with this magic? I don't know how this works. All right. I'm going to move on from there because it's really not that important in the end what happened. I knew it was you, Tom said. It had to be from the way you kept out of sight when I came. It was a pretty poor trick making Edna pretend to be your sister, and it didn't fool me for long anyway, and I needed to know how that bargain was made. And you helped her get Leslie, Mr. Piper said. I'm glad I made it. So Tom did know, and Mr. Piper just hid. Why did he pretend that Edna was his sister instead of his wife? Because, I'm sorry, guys. I'm just there's a lot of this that I wish that she had explained more here. So Be quiet, both of you, Laurel said. I'm obliged to you, Charles. Tom's life is one of the most valuable we've had. Even his infuriating habit of fighting everything I do. Morton needs a strong life just now, but the obligation has nothing to do with Leslie. At this, Mr. Piper lost his uneasy temper and shouted, "You unfeeling bitch." So she gets him sent off by security fairy thugs. I'm sorry, Tom, but you will find the bargain holds. The picture was yours. And Polly comes forward and says, okay, well, part of the agreement, part of the deal was that Mr. Leroy wasn't supposed to hurt Tom, though, right? And he definitely did try to hurt him a couple times. So I think that agreement is actually void, which it seems Laurel agrees with. And Mr. Leroy tries to act like that's not true, but they all seem to be aware. I can vouch for that, Sam said. We all can. So only Morton Leroy could have hurt him, said Anne, and you know that even better than I do. Morton, my dear, I think you may have been rather foolish. Mr. Leroy was shaking. His red-rimmed eyes rolled vengefully to Polly. It was my life she was stealing, he said chokily, but she was the one who stole the portrait from your room. You can get her for that. I'll take that into consideration, thank you, Laurel said, but I shall have to support Polly's claim, Morton, you see that. Come here, Seb. Tom reached out and seized Polly's hand. Who, me? Why? Said Seb. Silly. Laurel smiled and beckoned. I shall need you if Morton loses. Seb walked slowly over to the swinging seat. There was such a look of utter horror on his face that Polly realized this was what Seb had been afraid of all these years. She would have felt sorry for him if he had not said to her as he passed her, Laurel's not the only unfeeling bitch around here. It won't kill you, Polly said, literally. Okay, so that's what you're talking about, Patricia. I don't know what that means then if it doesn't kill him. Like, if they use him, if I shall need you if Morton loses. So she's talking about replacing. Okay. I see what you're saying. I got you now. Okay. Weird. What a weird thing. And Seb's mom isn't Laurel. Because I thought that maybe it secretly was. But if she's going to like marry him, so he's like a half-blood. Okay. I'm getting it. Starting to. Now, Morton, this is what I say. I shall give both of you a chance. Tom can use anything which is truly his. You can use the exact equivalent. The one who enters the pool first is the one who goes. Don't you think that's fair, Polly? Anything that's truly his. So this is the part I'm confused by. Polly looked down at the grass trying to work out what this meant. Laurel had taken steps to show Tom he could win. But why? Around her, everyone's feet were crowding as if people were trying to see something, and Seb for some reason was churring with laughter. She looked up. Seb was laughing at her, and Tom was no longer beside her. Seeing Seb's jeering face, it came to her that Seb had always loved her the way most people bear a grudge. He knew what Laurel meant. So he knows, but she apparently does not yet. They both are like head into this pool, and it's up to about their waists, and is sort of shimmering as like sort of that heat wave that happens. And a voice cheered Mr. Leroy. Several others called jeeringly to Tom to use the cello since he had made such a point of having it. Without thinking, Polly plunged forward to fetch the cello away. So I think she does that because the fact that they are encouraging him to use it to her seems like a bad sign. Tom decides that he's going to play, and he begins, and like the second that he does, he gets deeper in the pool. Tom and Polly understood. Tom on his own could not send Mr. Leroy to the pool. Any help sent Tom there instead. Out of the smear, the one clear thing was Laurel sitting upright in her seat watching Tom with a small, grave smile. Laurel, with chilly, malicious logic, had made sure there was only one way Tom could win. All right, Polly thought, so the only way to win is to lose. I'll have to lose. I don't understand this, guys. And I'm running out of time here, and I'm dying to I have so much more to ask because we're not even. So, Ed, there's a question that Tom asks her because Ed uses his violin to make a horse whinny sound. And Tom looks at Polly and asks what she thinks about trying to use the horse somehow. And she says, she thinks to herself that this is not going to work, that it would only turn against him. Tom had changed the horse for a car, but since Tom was Laurel's man with Laurel's gifts, that horse was still truly his. It was all the wild strength he had summoned up to get loose from Laurel. They were asking him to summon it again to defeat Mr. Leroy, hoping to use Laurel's unlucky gift against her. But Polly knew it would only turn against Tom. She tries to tell him not to do it, but he misunderstands her and calls it anyway. And finally, she decides to get into this pool herself. This is so strange. Polly knew she had to go on and lose. She was quite near to Tom when he succeeded in drawing the bow across the cello. It made a thundering rasp, which was taken up by the echoes of the current and prolonged to a chugging sort of snarl. Tom receded downward instantly. Ah, well, Polly thought, it wouldn't have worked. She passed the cello with echoes ebbing out of it and the bow floating and found Tom in front of her. This was a mistake, he said to her, wasn't it? Yes, said Polly. The horse was coming. She could feel its hoofbeats in the dying din of the cello. She could have got it horribly wrong, but the only way to turn that wild strength of the horse to Tom's advantage was to deprive him of it completely, to take everything away, and do it now, because the horse had arrived. When she craned her head in the impossible direction of the garden, she could see a huge bent golden shape racing across the green. And it was an even worse mistake, she said, the way you used me. You took me over as a child to save your own skin. You're not doing that again. Tom stared at her incredulously. She could see his eyes behind his glasses, as wide and gray with shock as they were when he first saw the horse. He had been completely sure of her. Polly could hardly blame him, but she had to go on. The horse was on its way down, screaming, lashing, fighting the current. Now you know how I felt, Polly said. Taste of your own medicine. We've nothing in common anyway, and I've got a career to come to. Then the horse came. It stood above them like a tower of golden flesh and bone, beating the current with its iron hooves and screaming, screaming. Polly saw a big eye tangled in pale horsehair and a huge square teeth. I never want to see you again, she screamed at Tom through its screams. The gray lump of Mr. Leroy slid past her into nothingness. Polly turned away as the horse hit them. What? Patricia, help me out here. I'm going to read you. I'm going to go to 8 to 10 after over my time, just so that I can read this to you, because I'm so confused here. But this article, or this essay, is from rushthatspeaks.dreamwidth.org, which I have no idea what that even is. This is from 2011, so I don't know that that's a thing anymore. So he quotes a bunch of sections. Here you see Tom's music and why it doesn't help directly. The quartet plays beautifully, but it can only play so long. This is also why arguing with Laurel directly doesn't work. Laurel lives in nowhere, and nowhere is to some extent outside of time. Mortal argument is only another delaying tactic. However, while the quartet is playing, Polly realizes that the wellspring at the bottom of the garden is potential and imagination, as well as the void of nothingness. Good art has this effect on people, and it makes them think about things. The argument uncovers a mistake that the King of Fairy made. While Tom was under the spell, no one was allowed to do anything that might kill him. Tom was to roam free in the world, blah, 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 blah. The rules have been broken, so argument moves to action. And it's possible to take action in nowhere. Fairy tales are full of people doing that. Now, remember that Polly held on to Tom when she did by using the Queen's gift against her, by living with Tom in between the two worlds. In here, now, Polly is a little girl and Tom an adult with romantic problems. In nowhere, Polly is nothing at all and Tom is a human sacrifice. In where, now, Polly is a hero and is Tom's loving, ever-faithful sidekick, and he is a hero and is free. Because of the Queen's gift, while Polly kept making that story, where now was the reality that mattered. I don't even know what that means. I'll be honest with you guys. Because of the Queen's gift, while Polly kept making that story, where now was the reality that mattered. Like, making that story about the faithful sidekick was where... Okay, so the fact that she was... all right, I'm trying to, like, figure this out, and I might be trying too hard. So, finally, with all the Queen's gifts, there's a catch. The way upward and the way downward are the same. Because the void is not just hell, because it is the wellspring of imagination, leaning and depending on the things you love and trust and consider part of yourself will send you closer to it. Tom summons his cello, and of course, practicing his art sends him closer to the source of art. Polly moves to try and help Tom, and of course, friendship sends him closer to the source of light. And the king may use the exact equivalent, but he has no art, he has no friends, so he does not use them and moves farther and farther away. In order to survive, Tom must have less of himself left to use than the king does, or else what he has left must turn against him. But because of Polly's position in Tom's life, in Tom's story, which is Tom's life, she can't just turn her back on him and walk away and expect that to do it. Tom made where now as much as she did, and he will keep making that story unless she gives it an ending. And she has to do it quickly because Tom has summoned the horse he made out of the Queen's gift, the force of himself that he had been using to fight against his fate, and she needs to turn that strength against him before it pushes him over the edge. So she walks into the pool to make him disbelieve and hate her. It is the only way out. Okay. I think there are two other good reasons that this works. The thing Polly does, besides the nature of the pool. One is that the horse, Tom's strength, is also the physical personification of his gift to make imagination real. So it sweeps the king before it because he does not exist in where now. He is never mentioned there. And when it hits them, it makes the version of the story Polly has been telling, wherein she hates Tom. What? It seals her decision of the ending because they both believe what she is saying when the power comes over them. This is why she had to lose him before it got there. She needs him to finish the story too. But when they come out of this, she doesn't hate him. The other reason is that she's telling the truth. She does on some level hate him. He did on some level take over her childhood. It is the first time in the entire book that a person has said outright and bluntly a hard and difficult truth of that sort. Everyone else in the novel spends a lot of time slithering out of that sort of thing. Yeah, so that's the closest I could get to, like, finding an explanation. Everywhere else that I looked, nobody else seemed to understand either. And that is simultaneously, like, comforting and frustrating. So the coda starts with, there was an interval of jarring pain, scourging cold and numbing heat, ages long. After that, the world hardened in jolting stages to pale whiteness, and with it came sadness. Such sadness. Polly found herself shivering and for some reason dripping wet, sitting on the edge of the concrete trough. The grass round it was grayed with the first frost of winter and grayed further by the rising sun. Water pattered her clothes and hair. "You meant that, didn't you?" he said. "Yes," said Polly, and thanks to Laurel, had to go on meaning it, or it would all be to do again. To love someone enough to let them go, you had to let them go forever, or you did not love them that much. All right, I did use you, I admit. All I can say is that I did my best not to hurt you, though there was probably no way not to. Are you quite determined never to see me again? I told you. All right, but I want to keep on seeing you. I've always wanted to keep seeing you. It may not work out between us, but I want to try. At least I can ask now. Won't you change your mind? Okay. It was the things not said that showed they might have a great deal in common. And Tom had spent so many years defying Laurel. Perhaps there was a way. This is quite impossible, Polly said carefully. For you, the only way to behave well was to behave badly. For me, the only way to win was to lose. You weren't to know me, and I wasn't to remember you. If two people can't get anywhere together, or can't get together anywhere, you think? Tom said with a shivery laugh. Nowhere? Yes, and if it's not true nowhere, it has to be somewhere. Polly laughed and held out her hands. We've got her, either way. What? Ah, you guys. Patricia? I'm so confused by this. I'm going to be like obsessing over this, trying to figure it out. So the quartet comes over and Leslie is also there. Leslie had been crying his eyes out, but he had recovered enough to pretend to be normal, which I'm like, why was he crying? Is she dead now? Is Laurel dead? But that last part is pretty clear though. I'm gonna disagree with you there, Patricia. I do not understand what that last part means at all. If it's not true nowhere, it has to be somewhere. Like, you're going to have to explain that one to me. And it ends with, that car of yours is sat on top of the roses back there. Squash them flat. Tom leaned his head against Polly's to laugh. Now that is impossible, he said. And that's the end of the book. So I'm going to sit here for a second. I went way over time. And let Patricia type out her explanation because I'm rereading this. For you, the only way to behave well was to behave badly. For me, the only way to win was to lose. You weren't to know me, and I wasn't to remember you. If two people can't get together anywhere, so they're now in nowhere, I guess? But nowhere is where she was, where Laurel was, so they can't be there. It has to be, and if it's not true nowhere, it has to be somewhere. We've got her either way. No, sorry. No idea. Oh, Patricia's in a meeting, so she can't type out her explanation. Yeah, that last part being pretty clear, maybe to you, lady, but I have got nothing. So, I really enjoyed this book, but this ending is baffling to me. And the fact that, I've spent some time searching for good explanations, and I could not fucking find one. That one that I found was the closest I got, and I had hoped that once I was, on camera and reading, that things would start to make sense, and that didn't crystallize for me either. So I'm going to keep looking. And if any of you have better ideas, if you have read this and you have some theories here, please, please, please comment in the group or on the post on Facebook or anywhere, because I really would like to know. And just help me out. Help me out, guys. Let me know. All right. Well, I'm going to wrap this up. Thank you again so much to Patricia for commissioning this. This book was really good. Really interesting and really emotional and just very well done. And it's made me want to read more of Wynn-Jones. So that's cool. And I hope that all of you have enjoyed the coverage. And I'm just really happy that I'm wrapping up on the third complete book for Spoil Me. This is pretty awesome. All right, everybody, if you would like to commission anything, you can go to unspoiledpodcast.com/shop. You can find me on facebook.com/unspoiledpod, Twitter at unspoiledshow, Instagram at unspoiledpodcast, and you can join the group for planning Spoil Me projects at facebook.com/groups/spoilmepod. Thank you, everybody, so much. Toodaloo, motherfuckers.
was an Unspoiled Network podcast.